think about when you're in Java versus, or when you're in C# versus working in JavaScript, what do you get out of the IDE and what are your expectations and how are they different from one to the other? I'm guessing that if you're like me, you have kind of a split personality disorder in how you use your IDE when you're working in a strongly typed language like Java or C# and a dynamic language like JavaScript. So as I mentioned, I have a similar background. I did a lot of Java development, obviously did a lot of Ext JS development with JavaScript. I also do a lot of Ruby development. And so I noticed there's a huge difference in what an IDE gives you when you're working in Java or C# versus JavaScript. And so let's look at why that is. So Java has static typing, it has closed classes, it has single inheritance, and there's a few big players in the framework market for Java. So Java is very predictable, and it's kind of a very safe and reassuring language. JavaScript, despite it being a very simple language, can kind of be scary. JavaScript has dynamic typing. JavaScript doesn't really have a concept of what classes are. You have prototypical inheritance, and you basically have open objects. So classes are assembled from any number of ways. JavaScript doesn't have a nice, clean inheritance model. Yes, you can inherit a prototype of a function, but you also have mix-ins and overrides and monkey patches. So it's very unpredictable. And in JavaScript, there's a lot of different frameworks. And unlike in Java, where you normally pick one framework and stick with it for a given project, JavaScript, you might be using Knockout and Backbone, or you might be using Angular and a bunch of other stuff together. So it's very difficult for an IDE to provide the same level of support in terms of things like code completion, fixes, and inspections than it can with something like Java. And so when I set about working on an IDE plugin, I kind of wanted to bring the Java experience to JavaScript developers in terms of the plugin only showing you the things that are correct, never showing you anything that's not correct, and giving you a complete picture of what's there when you do code completion in the IDE. So fortunately, at Sencha, we have Ext JS. And with Ext JS, we can do a lot better than you would typically expect from a JavaScript IDE. So in Ext JS, we have a robust class system that has really well-defined constructs for inheritance, for mix-ins, even for patches through overrides. And unlike other frameworks, it's a complete framework. So you're not likely to bring in a lot of other libraries when you're setting up an Ext JS project. We have models, views, view controllers, controllers. Basically, it's an all-encompassing framework. And it's also got excellent type metadata through our JSDoc comments. We use a system called JSDoc. And so with all of that, we can build a pretty awesome plugin that's going to be very, very accurate when it provides code completion and when it provides fixes. So some of you may be aware of the Eclipse plugin that was released a few years ago. And so this plugin is a little bit of a departure and definitely an improvement upon that. So one of the biggest things is there's no additional libraries to install or dependencies to set up. And it works both on your own classes as well as the Ext JS framework classes. I believe the Eclipse plugin either had some rebuilding time or it didn't work on your classes at all, but it would sometimes help with the Ext JS classes. So a big difference is our plugin for JetBrains inspects all of your code, indexes it, and as you update your framework or as you monkey patch classes or as you build out your own classes, it's going to treat all of those exactly the same and provide you the same completion experience. So as new Ext JS versions are rolled out, as 6 comes out, 7, and years further, you're not going to need to necessarily update the plugin to support all of that. When you change code or when the framework changes code, it's automatically going to see all that and automatically going to update all of its internal metadata, and completion is going to work instantly. So I mentioned minimal dependencies. So JetBrains just recently overhauled their JavaScript API, and we make use of that. So I noticed a few people kind of caught a sneak preview and tried to download the plugin this morning. There was one post on the Sencha forums already about PHP Storm not working. So some of the IDEs from JetBrains that support this new IDE, this API are out, and some are not. IntelliJ is out, WebStorm is out. I believe RubyMine is still in EAP. PHP Storm is still in EAP, and PyCharm, I think, just started the EAP. So you definitely want to check and make sure you've got the latest version of your IDE before you try and install it. So remaining dependencies, you have to have the Ext JS framework development source somewhere in your project. So most of you are probably using Sencha command, and so you already have that. But if you're not, if you're just using a CDN or if you're using like Ext all, then you'll need to put the full-blown source somewhere in your project because that's what the plugin's going to use to inspect things and to build out its definitions. And if you're using Sencha command, it's going to give you some extra stuff. It's not a requirement that you have it. So I'm going to dive into just kind of a high-level view of some of the features, and then I'll go into a demo and show you how cool this thing really is. So obviously the biggest thing that I think all of us want out of an IDE plugin is code completion. And this is really where we spent most of our time in making a really great experience. So here's just a list of some of the highlights in terms of what it will complete. I think everybody's going to like the top one here the most. So in any UI framework, if it's going to be worth anything at all, it's going to allow for a lot of customization. And if you go on any class in our docs in Ext, there's a ton of different configs you can set. And so you no longer are going to have to pop back and forth to the docs to figure out what those all are. You just hit Control Space, and you get a nice menu like this, like Jason was showing this morning. So configs, methods, properties, class names, anything that's like an alias, like X types or layouts, those are all completed. Even event names, CSS classes, stores, models, fields, the whole thing. Basically, anywhere you are in your code, we aim to be able to complete and show you everything that is possible there and nothing that isn't, so you can depend on it. So the plugin also provides some neat code inspection. So this is one I think you'll like. So you know the requires and the uses arrays that you can put on your class. So if your class requires other classes to be loaded for it to work, you'll typically want to outline those in the requires array at the top of your class. So managing that thing can be a bit of a pain. Every time you add a new dependency or build out your class, there's more things that potentially might not be loaded. So the plugin really helps with this. By default, it'll flag any classes that you use that are not in the requires array. And you can also check off an option that will automatically manage the requires array for you. So as you add and remove code, it'll automatically add and remove from that requires array and do the same thing with the uses array if you choose. So it'll also flag references to classes and aliases like X types that don't exist. So if you refactor something out of existence, but you still have uses of that, it'll flag those for you and let you know they're not there. It'll also handle where your class names are out of sync with your file names, or your fully qualified class name, including the namespace, is out of sync with where it is in the folder structure. It'll show you if something's misnamed, and then it'll also provide a quick fix to either rename the class, or move the class, or rename the file, or move the file. And also, one of the things that Jason showed this morning, which I think is really going to be an awesome workflow, as you're building out your functionality of your applications, if you build out a view, and then you say, I'm listening to an event on this view, and you point it to a method on your view controller, and that method doesn't exist yet, it'll flag that, and then it'll give you a quick fix where you can go and add that method, and it'll give you the correct signature. I think that was shown this morning. So as I develop a little demo later, I'll show that as well. And then also, if you're building a view component and you override init component and you forget to call this.call parent, if you've ever done that, you know that can lead to some pretty disastrous results. So the plugin will flag that for you, and it'll automatically add a this.call parent for you at the end of the method. So all of these code inspections, it'll provide what are called quick fixes. If you're familiar with JetBrains IDEs, you get that little light bulb, you click that, and then it'll fix your problem for you. So we also put in some limited support for refactoring, and we mainly concentrated on the conventions around file naming and also namespacing with respect to where a file is within the app structure. So as you drag and move a class file around within your folder structure, it will automatically update the class name. And then also, if you rename the class or rename the file, it will keep the class or file name in sync automatically. There's also some pretty cool stuff with code generation. So in Ext JS, we have classes, but we also have many different kinds of classes and some important ones. So in addition to just the base class, which we'll put in like an Ext define call, we can also create views. So when you choose to create a new class, you can choose the kind, and then if you pick view, you'll get some nice boilerplate with the view. Same thing with things like view models, view controllers. It'll put in some extra code for you, some of it commented out, some of it with defaults that kind of remind you the common elements of what are supposed to be in those types of classes. There's also one live template that I added, and we'll probably be adding more of these. If you do XC and then tab, it'll automatically do ext create for you. So it just helps you author those constructors a little faster. So there's a really cool feature, and some of you may know this. How many of you are using ext5? OK. So you know with ext5, we added view controllers. And a common design pattern is when you have a new feature in your application, you'll create a new folder and a new namespace with a view controller, and a view model. And they're all supposed to be wired up and talking to one another. So in the plugin, I created a feature called new view package. So with one click and typing in one name of the view, it will automatically create a folder and those three things and wire them up all together so you can develop your features a lot faster. And one that's really cool, I think you're really going to like. So obviously, the grid is a very popular component and a lot of the reason why people use ext. So a lot of these applications in the enterprise are essentially glorified Excel in the cloud. Big tables, lots of columns, complicated data models. So if you use the plugin and you have a grid with a store, and that store has a model, it will automatically generate all of the columns for your grid and automatically name them based on the properties in your model. So you don't have to go through and do all that boilerplate. Thank you, yes. So I will show that. And one last thing before I get into the demo. So many of you may use this, many of you may not. If you're running a backend language like Java or Ruby or C#, you already have a server and you probably boot up your Java server to test things. But if you're not doing that and you're using Sencha App Watch to test your application in development, you can now run that directly from the IDE. So you don't have to pop back and forth to the command line. And the nice thing about that as well is Sencha App Watch will do a runtime compilation of your SAS files. And so if there are errors in that, or any errors at all when it's compiling, you'll see those at the bottom docked in your IDE. You won't have to jump back and forth to the console to see those. OK, so I'm going to demo this cool plugin. Unfortunately, Jason Klein, he gave a great demo this morning, but he kind of stole my thunder, because that was one of the coolest features he showed in terms of creating methods from event listeners. But I'm going to show the whole thing kind of from scratch here. OK, so I have a project open. And as Jason mentioned, this will work with all of your existing projects. You don't have to start from scratch, but I'm going to show you basically coding an app from scratch just to show how easy this all is. And so what I'm going to do is this is what I'm actually going to code up. So it's going to be a simple grid application where we're managing a list of users. And if you click on a row, you get a dialog where you can edit an individual row. Very trivial application, but I think has a lot in common with a lot of things that we've all built. OK, so I'm going to close out this existing application, and I'm going to start from scratch. So we give you two new project types. And I'm doing this in WebStorm, but as I mentioned, it works in many of the JetBrains IDEs. WebStorm just happens to be one that's just purely focused on JavaScript, so it's kind of a cleaner experience. But you can do this in all of their IDEs. So when you start out, you can either pick an Ext JS app or an Ext JS workspace. So the difference is that a workspace would have multiple apps in it. I'm just going to pick the app to start off with, because we're just going to do something simple. It will ask you where you want to create your project. So let's call this presentation. And it'll automatically find Sencha command on your system. But if for some reason it doesn't, or if there's a specific version of command you want to use, if you have multiple versions, you can pick the version here. And then you can pick one of the themes as well. So Neptune, I think, shows up best in a setting like this, so I'll pick that. So underneath the hood, it's actually communicating with Sencha command and running Sencha generate app. So that'll take a few seconds as it compiles a new app structure. And then you'll all be familiar with this. So open up, there's our app structure. And you'll notice on the bottom here, it's doing some indexing. So the plugin doesn't come with any kind of metadata definitions or real understanding of Ext JS other than the conventions of Ext JS. So right now, it's looking at all of the source code, both the Ext JS source code and also the scaffolding code that it generated, and any code that you would have, indexing it all so that we can do completion. And so it's done. So what I'm going to do, and if we pop back, so we have a grid here. what I'm going to start with is the model for that grid. So we have the user's name, the age, the gender, and the username. So let's pop into our model folder here. And the scaffolding leaves that empty. And actually, before I start, let's check that scaffold worked and that everything's running. So when you create a new project, you get the run configuration automatically. So if I just press play here, it will boot up Sencha App Watch. And in a second, we'll be able to actually view that in our browser. There we go. So that's the ext5 starter screen. And so let's define our model. So if you go to New in your model folder, you can pick New Ext JS class. As I mentioned, here are the different kinds of classes you can create. And it sees that I'm in the model folder, so it makes model the default. So let's create a model for our user. And when you create a class of a particular kind, it'll throw in some of the boilerplate code that's common in the class of that kind. So I pulled this from the Sencha documentation, and it's kind of a helpful reminder of some of the things you might want to put in, for instance, your model. So here we have some example fields. And I'm actually going to take some of these because they're from a user example. So let's get rid of phone. Let's bump username up to the top. We'll get rid of alive, take off the trailing comma. And we're not going to do any kind of validation or any real hookup to a back end, so we'll get rid of those. So now we have our model. So let's take a look at the view. So the view that it throws in by default is this kind of boilerplate two-pane view with tabs. I'm just going to get rid of all that and show you how we're going to code this from scratch. So instead of extending container, I'm going to extend panel. And so here's where completion comes in. I can just hit Control Space, and it'll bring up all of the classes available to me, both classes that I've authored and classes from within ext. And I know that the full name of this class is ext.panel or ext.grid.panel. So I can type that. Or if I don't know that, or if I'm kind of lazy, or if I remember that it's a grid, I can just type grid as well, and it'll still find it, hit Enter, and it'll complete. OK. So let's add the store here. So if we're going to pull a store in to use with our grid, we want to do that through the view model. And so the way that we can do that is we already have a view model here that was created by the scaffolding. So let's pull that in to our grid. So if we autocomplete here, do view model, and then it knows all the view models that are available. In this case, we just have one. So again, all I'm doing is just hitting Control Space a lot here. So it'll pull in our main view model. And I know we're also going to do some interactivity with this grid in terms of clicking and then seeing a dialog. So let's pull in our view controller as well. So to do that, we do controller. And then there's also a main controller. And since I'm going to override some of the properties of this model, instead of referencing it directly like that, let's reference it by type. And again, it understands both variants. So I can do completion there as well. And you notice, as I've been adding these dependencies, it's automatically updating my requires array. That's not enabled by default, because it's kind of a very aggressive feature. But if you go into the settings within the plugin, you can turn that on if you'd like. If not, what it would do, this would just be gone, and these two references to your view model and to main controller here would be underlined with little squiggly lines, and then we could add those using a quick fix. OK, so we've got our grid, but we don't really have any columns yet, and we don't really have a functioning store. So let's pop over to our view model, and we can just do that by holding down Control, or in this case, on a Mac, Command, and then clicking on main here, and it'll take us right to our view model. And let's add a store. So in this case, we can do stores. Let's give it a name, so users. And the plugin's actually smart enough to know that the values in this object array in the stores config are store configs. So if I hit Control Space here, it knows this is a store, and it's going to automatically start completing properties on a store. So we need a few things with a store. There's some boilerplate here. So we need a proxy. We're going to use a REST proxy. And we're actually going to pull a file from the local file system. So we can do type rest. And we need a reader. It's going to be a JSON file. So type JSON. Now, how many people would actually remember all of this stuff? I mean, I would imagine I wouldn't see very many hands. OK, very good. But most of us would be popping back and forth to the docs to do this kind of stuff. But the plugin is a great tool, not only for learning what's there, but also just remembering. I mean, I've been using Ext JS for years. I wouldn't remember all this stuff. So we have our reader. We need a URL. And haven't created the file yet, but it's going to be resources/users.json. And we're going to need to auto-load. OK. So you notice also it added our 2 dependencies here automatically. And now we have our view model. So let's pop back to our view here. The view model's all wired up. So let's start adding our columns. So this is pretty cool. So data index, oh, no suggestions. Why not? It's because we haven't actually bound our store yet. So if we use the ext5 data binding, we can use bind. And then you notice it's also smart enough that when you're in a bind object, it just brings up all the properties again, so you can figure out what properties you want to bind. Let's bind a store. And so I can also do control space in here. And it'll look on my view model and tell me what properties are available. So in this case, we're going to bind the user store. And we can start adding our columns. So it should, you know why? Because we need to pop back to our thing here. And the one thing we forgot is the model that we originally created. So again, auto-completing all the way. Now that we have our model, we also have our columns here. So you don't even have to remember those. So let's add username, and then we would need text and username. Now I could continue adding the rest of these, but why do that when it'll just do it for me? So if you do Command N, or there's also a way I believe to do through the right-click menu, you can do generate, and it'll bring up that same menu. If I click there, it'll just automatically add the rest of the columns on that store. Thank you. And also, not shown here, it's very smart about naming the columns as well. So not only do you get just the data index, but it will automatically crittify the names of those columns. So it'll turn camel into spaces, and it'll uppercase the first letter as well. OK. So last thing before I run this, I'm going to need to actually add my data file. So let me do this. Users.json. And I actually have one handy here. Paste that in. OK. So we still have Sencha app watch running. So we should be able to come over here and refresh. And so we got everything except, I think, the one that I actually entered myself. The index, username, let's see. What was username? OK, not sure why that's not showing up. Maybe I just typed it wrong? Let's see. Oh, look at that. I have no username property in here. Good job. Great preparation, Mark. Way to go. Awesome. Well, OK, so we'll get rid of username. Best laid plans. Cool. So there's our grid. So now let's say we want to make this thing interactive. So we want, when we click on one of these, to get a dialog that pops up and be able to edit a row. So you could go to your controller and create the method and then wire it back up. But I think a much better workflow is to start from your view. So since we're in a grid here, let's figure out what events are there. So you can do a listeners object. And then if you autocomplete here, it'll bring up all the events on your grid. So we want, in this case, item click, and let's add a method. So let's call it onUserClick. And so this is one of the inspections that'll fire. So you see it kind of underlined this and graded out. And I'm not sure if you can see it all the way from back there, but it says method onUserClick not found in your controller. So if I click on that and then click the little light bulb, it'll pop back and it will automatically add that method. And this is the really cool thing. So it adds all of the parameters that come into that method, which nobody remembers. And so you don't have to pop back to the docs. You have that all right here. So let's just verify that this is working. Let's do good old-fashioned poor man's console.log, and then record. Hey, look, it actually knows that this is a model, and it's going to complete stuff here. So let's do record.get, and then let's throw in the name property here. As we click, there's our event listener. OK, so let's do something a little bit more interesting than just alerting. Let's actually create a feature to view this user in a dialog. So the way we can do that is let's go into our view package here. So we have our main feature, and that's kind of our grid here. That's what the user sees when they first come in. Let's create a feature to view the user. So what we can do is, I could create all these classes individually, but I want to go a little faster. So let's do a new view package. So the way that this works is you just tell it the view class name, and it'll automatically derive the names of the model and the controller from that. So let's just call it user. And by default, it will automatically create the view model and the view controller. Hit OK. And so that's going to create this nice little package for us. And this is the way Sencha would do it. So we get our user view, and we also get a controller and a model that we're going to use. So by default, it extends container, but in this case, we want a dialog. So let's change this to a window, ext.window. And OK, so we'll keep our view model and our controller. We're going to have some items, obviously. Let's pick a layout. So we can automatically code complete through that as well. Let's go with an anchor layout. It's going to be kind of a little form. And let's add some items. So what do we have here? So we have name, age, and gender. Let's go with name is going to be X type. So in addition to fully qualified class names, you can also autocomplete X types. So let's do text field. And let's give it a field label of name. And then let's create the remaining fields. So gender, let's make that combo. Let's give it a store, which is just going to be male and female. And let's do, we had age. So age is, instead of a text field, let's make it a number field. So you can see how useful this is. You don't have to really remember all those different X types. If you have a vague idea of what you're doing, it will remind you. It'll tell you what's available. So we have our form here. And let's go back and verify that things are working. So nope, we forgot to actually open it. So let's pop back to our main controller. And instead of doing our alert here, let's actually create an instance of that view. So we could do ext.create blah, 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 blah. Or we can just do xc tab, and we get ext create, hit control space again, and we're going to bring up our user view. And we need to get the data to the view somehow. So on this event listener for item click, the actual record behind that row in the grid comes to us. And so what we can do is let's add some stuff to the view model associated with this user. Let's add data and let's wire in the user this way. Okay, and the last thing we need in order to get our window to actually show is to just do auto show true. So we do that, and we click. Okay, we have our dialog. No data is actually being populated yet. No title. Let's see if we can improve that. So if you wanted to hop to the actual class where this is defined, you could just hit Command and then click on it and go right there. And let's add some buttons at the bottom. Buttons. OK, so I could do Ext type and then button here. But buttons always defaults to having buttons. So we don't even need to do that. The plugin's smart enough to know, if you look here, it's giving me button configs instead of just container configs. So let's give this text. Let's have a save button, even though we're really not going to use a backend. And let's also have a cancel button. Okay. And so we need to now actually bring the data into this dialog. Remember, we have nothing here. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to bind some stuff from our view model. So let's do user.name, and let's do bind user.gender. And let's do bind user.age. OK. And let's also bind the title of this dialog to the username as well. OK. So now when we edit, we have our data fully populated. And so you notice if I click cancel here, nothing happens. Cancel and save do nothing. So let's just round out the example by finishing that off. So again, I could go to the controller and create the actual method for closing the dialog, but let's not. Let's instead just do, in this case, we could do a listener as well, but let's just do handler. So here we can do on save click, and we'll do a similar method here. And it's telling us those methods don't exist, so we'll just have it created for us. Handlers in this case don't really take any arguments, they just get called. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to do this dot get view, which it completes for us. And then it knows that the view is a component, and so we're going to do dot close. And I'm going to be really lazy. We're not actually going to save anything. We're just going to kind of simulate what the user would see. And so I'll make the same thing for on cancel click. So now if we refresh, looks like sentry command may have died. Let's restart. Okay, bonus points for whoever sees the problem here. User model. There's a missing comma somewhere, I'm sure, in the view. OK, so user.js. Thank you very much. I knew that was going to happen. OK. But see, that's pretty cool, though. So I didn't have to pop back to the command prompt in order to see that. That just came right here within the IDE. So it's a lot less disruptive. I totally planned that, by the way. OK. So now we have our event listeners for save and cancel. Of course, our customer will be very unhappy because it doesn't actually save anything. But as far as the demo, that's what I wanted to show. So just to round out the presentation here, OK. So obviously, we just released this today. You can actually go in through your IDE or through senchicon.com and download and start using this plugin right now, assuming you have the right version of your IDE. But there are some limitations and some things that we're still working on. We're planning on doing general availability sometime in June, or right about the same time I believe that X6 is going to come out. And so these are the limitations that are there so far. So most of our testing has actually been in Ext JS and not Touch yet. So the experience is going to be better in Ext JS, but it'll still be pretty good in Touch. It still does all the auto-completion. Obviously, you can't make use of the view controllers and the two-way data binding the same way until you upgrade to X6. If you're using this with Touch and you notice configs are not completing in some places, try adding an X class or an X type to your object literal, and it definitely will complete. And then also, so projects that have both an Ext JS and Sencha Touch app in the same project within the IDE, that's going to be a little dicey right now. It's much better when there's only one versus the other. And the reason for that is there's a lot of class names that are the same in both what we're calling toolkits now. And so that's something that's obviously going to be rectified by the time this goes to general availability. That's a huge part of Ext JS 6, and that's really our #1 priority when we get back to the office next week. But for now, that may be kind of a degraded experience. So as I mentioned, getting access, make sure you upgrade your IDE, and in some cases, you may have to use the EAP version for a couple of days or maybe a week or so while those get rolled out. Again, I mentioned that IntelliJ and WebStorm are already out with the newest APIs, but the others like RubyMine and PHPStorm, I believe, are still in EAP. You can download the plugin from within the IDE or from senchicon.com. And I believe from senchicon.com is as of like 6 tonight, they're going to update the site. So the EA release is available today. And again, I think it's very fully featured, and I think it'll be really helpful, so I encourage you to try it and give us some feedback. And we'll definitely be adding things and fixing things based on that feedback. But the GA is going to come in June. And in the meantime, best way to give feedback is through the Sencha forum. So when you download the plugin, if you go to the help menu in your IDE, you'll see a link to give feedback. That'll take you to the forums. That's also linked in the docs that come with the plugin. And so that's the best way really to give feedback. So thank you very much. I'd like to take any questions that are available. We still have about 11 minutes. So please, yes, you can just come on up.
Okay, maybe I can just talk. I was just wondering if you could just give a comparison of Architect versus this plugin for WebStorm.
Wow, look, we just got hacked. So Architect versus the plugin for WebStorm. So obviously Architect starts with a visual builder. And the IDE experience, the text editor experience in Architect is kind of the secondary thing. So obviously this is addressing much more of folks who want to be pure developers. It's definitely an alternative to Architect. So if you're a person who thinks code first, visuals second, you want to dive right into an IDE, the best thing you can do is use this plugin and use a JetBrains IDE and get a great experience. Yes?
I use Refactoring from JetBrains Visual Studio. One of the features that I like a lot and use a lot is sorting and ordering code for C#. You know that feature we provided this plugin as well?
So ReSharper is a difficult one. ReSharper is implemented in C#, and it's not implemented in Java. And so the JavaScript support in ReSharper is different from what it is in IntelliJ and the rest of the IDEs. So right at this time, ReSharper is not supported. We're also going to be working on a Visual Studio plugin for the C# community, but that effort is just starting. Yes?
It looks like you have it pretty well defined now at this point. Are there any plans to allow us to write unit testing now for Ext JS?
I haven't done anything with unit testing yet. That's obviously a great suggestion. And I think that's something we'll take a look at very shortly, but it's not in the current build.
Can you talk about overrides?
Right. So the nice thing is overrides are kind of tricky to deal with. But we were forced to deal with them because a lot of the functionality in the ext core comes from overrides. And so any of the monkey patching overrides or whatever you want to call it that you do, if you use ext override to do it, the plugin will pick that up and pick up all the new properties or configs or methods. We had to do that because a lot of the ext core is defined that way. We don't know about pricing just yet. So the EA version that's available now, anybody can download and use. But when it actually is released, pricing is still unconfirmed. Yes?
Is there anything that helps prevent access to private members?
So the plugin does understand private versus protected versus public, and the way that it understands that is through the JS-Duck metadata. So I encourage everybody, if you're building your own APIs or even classes on top of Ext, use or look into JS-Duck, which is an extended set of JS-Doc. You can have @private, @protected in there, and it won't show the members that are not accessible in the traditional sense from wherever you are in code. So if you're trying to access a method that's private from another class, it won't show it during code completion.
Does it highlight if you have already used it?
It actually doesn't do that, but that's a great suggestion. So I think Chris, who works with me, is probably going to take that one down, and we'll probably put that in.
I'm just trying to approximate when we can get plugin for Visual Studio. In order to get that very rough estimation, how long did it take to get it to get plugin for JetBrains?
So I'm actually a new hire at Essentia. I joined in December, right before Christmas. And so that's the timeline that I spent, basically up until about a week ago, full-fledged developing this. And so Visual Studio, the effort is starting just now, but I can't give you, a timeline other than that anecdotal evidence.
No, nobody does. Yeah.
But you would think the next one would be faster because we've already done it once.
Thanks.
Yes?
Does the plugin support documentation lookup?
Yes, so you can hover over anything in the code, whether it's a config or a method or whatnot. And if you hit F1 or there's other shortcuts as well in the IDE, it'll bring up the docs. Yes, one more?
What about debugging?
So debugging, it doesn't do anything specific with debugging. You'd still be using your Chrome debugger or whatever, Firebug or whatever.
Use JavaScript debugging from IntelliJ IDEas. Should be combined with.
No, I don't support that yet. Great idea, but no, not supported yet. Yes?
Is there any plan to support like seamless integration with Sencha Architect?
There's no integration with Architect at this time. So we wanted to get a really good plugin experience purely for developers to start with. Architect maybe down the road, but not this time, no.
Okay, thanks.
Yes?
Does it work with version 4?
Version 4 of Ext JS? Yeah, so version 4 is really where it starts working. As you know, the class system got overhauled completely, basically from 3 to 4. So anything 4 plus will be good. It really relies on that ext define, basically, and the overrides to be able to understand things. Other questions?
Do any of the senior architects Essentia use Architect? I mean, if you're a crank, do you just live in the code?
So obviously, I'm new to Sencha, so I don't know everyone yet. So in our office in Maryland, we're all based in basically the tools team and the space team, and I don't know any of the 4 of us. It's only 4 of us that do. But certainly a lot of the training and support staff use it when they're out there in the wild implementing things for their customers.
I struggle with the learning curve because you start with Architect and you're doing this visual stuff and you're really not comprehending what's behind it. And so I'm almost wondering if I should just start in the code side.
Well, the plugin will help you do that.
I mean, the most advanced developers, I don't know if you have the heart of my question,
Mm-hmm.
once you end up knowing that you're flying around, adding this, adding the view and all that, once you get that knowledge in your head, most senior developers don't use the visual?
I guess it depends on where you're starting, but really, that's one thing we're doing to address the type of developers who aren't going to start with that. Is this plugin is another way that you can use to either remember what's there or to start out and learn the framework anew. And so if you're more comfortable just coding from the start, I'm sure a lot of developers are. Personally, I am as well. And so I would start with using this plugin as that kind of entry point into the framework. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much all for coming. I encourage you, come up, take a sticker, take stickers, leave your business cards. One of you will get selected for the free WebStorm license. Thank you.